At my son's luxury family dinner, I walked in expecting to give him a four-generation heirloom watch. Instead, I found my seat removed while investors watched me stand alone. My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "People like him don't need a chair. He should be grateful for leftovers." My son looked away and whispered, "Don't ruin this night, Dad." I stayed silent until I saw the name on their presentation screen and realized the dinner was never about family. What matters most is the message about holding on to your dignity and finding where your strength comes from. I was gripping the vest Vera had picked out 4 years prior, back when her hands could still manage such things, and I had no way of knowing this evening would mark the last time I placed my trust in my son. The fabric had gone soft in a way that surprised me, given everything it had been through. Deep charcoal with faint burgundy stripes, the sort of pattern that made a man look solid, reliable, like someone who kept his word. Vera always said it made me look like the kind of man people could count on. She had a way of being right about things like that. Most things, really. Welcome back to Honor Revenge Stories, a place where the truth always finds a way out, no matter how long it takes. If stories like this one stay with you, I'd be glad if you'd subscribe and hit the like button. It helps more people find their way here. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Have you ever trusted someone close to you only to find out they were working against you the whole time? Drop a yes or a no in the comments. I read everyone. A quick note before we begin: some details in this story have been shaped for the purpose of telling it well, and any resemblance to specific real persons or events is coincidental. What matters most is the truth at the heart of it. 38 years of marriage taught me that the hard way. 4 years since the cancer took her, and I still reach for this vest when something mattered. Tonight mattered. Family dinner at Magnolia Terrace, Garrett's favorite restaurant. My son, 39 years old, finally settling down after years of 80-hour weeks building the Whitmore Heritage Project. His wife, Renee, had organized everything, sent the invitation on cream cardstock with gold lettering, a celebration of family and new beginnings. I buttoned the vest, slowly, my fingers stiffer than they used to be. 71 years old, retired insurance fraud investigator, 38 years reading people, catching liars, finding the holes in stories that didn't add up. I'd interviewed thousands of claimants, studied facial expressions, voice inflections, the micro gestures that betrayed deception. I was never wrong about reading people. But tonight I wasn't investigating. Tonight I was just a father. The pocket watch sat in its velvet box and the dresser silver, catching the February afternoon light through my bedroom window. My great-grandfather's watch handed down through 4 generations of DeVroe men. Tonight, Garrett would become the 5th. I'd been waiting months for the right occasion to give it. A family celebration felt like the moment. I lifted the watch carefully and felt its weight settle into my palm. The engraving on the back read, "Time keeps faith." My father had explained those words to me when I was 12. Time reveals. Truth separates the genuine from the false, proves who holds to their word. A fraud investigator's philosophy, carved in silver in 1891. The chain slid cool between my fingers as I tucked the watch into the vest pocket. 4 generations. Tonight Garrett would carry it forward, would come to understand what it meant to belong to something bigger than himself. I'd raised him with honest work, clear principles, and respect for family. Vera would have been proud. The watch ticked steady against my chest. 4 generations of DeVroe men, and I was about to find out what the 5th had made of himself. Magnolia Terrace smelled of money and candlelight when I came through the carved oak doors. The hostess led me toward the wisteria room, their largest private banquet space. My dress shoes struck the marble floors, each step echoing in the high-ceilinged corridor. I heard the party before I saw it. Laughter, the ring of wine glasses, conversation, humming at that particular pitch of people who know they're somewhere expensive. I straightened my vest, felt the watch's reassuring weight, and pushed open the door. 14 people sat around a long table draped in ivory linen. Candlelight played off crystal stemware and gold-rimmed china. The centerpieces were towering white peonies and olive branches arranged in sweeping, deliberate compositions. Everything looked like a magazine photograph, except there was no chair for me. I stood in the doorway and counted twice to be certain. 14 chairs, 14 guests, all seated. My son Garrett sat near the center, wearing the navy suit I'd helped him pick out last Christmas. Beside him, Renee DeVroe, 36, event planning specialist. Her blonde hair pinned into the kind of twist that requires a professional's hands, she adjusted a floral arrangement with practiced ease. Two chairs sat empty beside an older couple I recognized. Clifton Ardmore, 65, silver-haired and talking to another guest with the loose confidence of a man accustomed to introducing himself as a successful real estate investor. His wife, Nadette, 60, wore a diamond necklace angled to catch the light. Renee's parents. I'd met them once briefly at the wedding 3 years back, but those two chairs weren't truly empty. They held things. A blush-toned Gucci handbag, a designer wool coat, personal belongings set out with deliberate care claiming territory. Nobody looked at me. The conversation rolled on. Someone was laughing about a ski trip. Wine poured for 14 people who belonged, and one man in the doorway wearing his dead wife's favorite vest. Mr. Devereaux, a young woman materialized at my elbow, late 20s, black uniform, silver Magnolia Terrace name tag. Lena Caswell, event coordinator. Her eyes moved from me to the table and back uncertain. I'll get you a chair right away. No. Renee's voice cut across the room, sharp and unhurried. She hadn't raised it, but everyone heard. The conversation stopped. Don't. It would ruin the entire layout. Everything is balanced exactly as it needs to be. Lena stopped mid-step. Her arm was already extended toward a chair along the wall. She looked at me, then at Renee, then at me again. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. Just stand for a moment, Dad. Garrett's voice barely there. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze had settled somewhere in his water glass. Or maybe the tablecloth. Maybe nothing at all. The meal won't be long. 14 chairs, 14 guests, and I was the only one on my feet. The pocket watch ticked in my vest pocket. My son, the boy I'd raised, the man I was about to hand, 4 generations of family legacy, sat at a table I'd paid for and told me to stand while strangers ate. Clifton Ardmore's eyes met mine for one brief moment. Something flickered behind them. Recognition. 17 years ago, I had investigated an insurance claim for fire damage to a commercial property he owned. The claim was fraudulent. I'd proved it. He'd walked away with a warning rather than charges because the evidence was circumstantial and his attorney was expensive. He looked away first. I stood beside the table, the heirloom watch heavy in my vest pocket, while my son and 13 guests worked through the 5-course meal. Lena lingered near the kitchen doors, her expression apologetic, her hands empty. The chair holding Renee's Gucci bag sat exactly where it had been 2 feet off my left shoulder. And then Renee smiled at Lena and said something that changed everything. Lena came back with a folding chair from the kitchen, moving quietly along the wall, and Renee's voice cut through the room like a blade. He's used to living simply, Lena. No raised volume, no need for it. Every word landed across the candlelit table, perfectly audible to all 14 guests. Someone like him doesn't need a fancy chair. Perhaps he only deserves to stand there gnawing on leftover bones from everyone's plates. A few guests laughed. Not loud, not outright cruel, just the uneasy sound people make when someone with power says something ugly and they don't know where to look. A woman in pearls covered her mouth. A man in a gray suit smiled into his wine glass. Lena stopped mid-step, the folding chair hanging from her hand. The color drained out of her face. She looked at me, then at Renee, then at the chair as though it had become evidence of something. "Put it back," Renee said. Not a request. Lena put it back. I looked at my son. Garrett sat 3 feet away, fork in hand, candlelight glinting off the navy suit I'd helped him buy. The suit I'd paid for because he said it mattered for client meetings. His eyes stayed on his plate. Pan-seared Dover, sole with microgreens arranged in careful formation. "Do you also think I only deserve leftovers, son?" My voice came out quieter than I meant it to. 38 years of interview rooms had shown me that a soft question often lands harder than a raised one. Garrett's jaw tightened. He still wouldn't look at me when he answered. His voice barely carried over the ambient music drifting from hidden speakers. "Don't ruin our important evening, Dad, please." Our important evening. The one I was standing through. The one I'd apparently paid for. I had noticed the invoice on Garrett's kitchen counter last week, when I dropped off Ren's birthday present early, $4,000 for a private banquet at Magnolia Terrace. He'd told me it was a business networking event, said cash flow was tight with the new project, asked if I could help cover the cost. I'd written the check that same afternoon. I was standing at a dinner I had funded listening to my daughter-in-law compare me to a dog begging for scraps while my son told me not to ruin the evening. The pocket watch ticked in my vest pocket. Vera's vest, the one she said made me look trustworthy. How does a father answer when his son chooses silence over defense? I didn't answer. I stood there beside the table while a server appeared with the second course crab bisque in white bowls, each one finished with a swirl of creme fraiche on top. The smell of crab and thyme moved through the air. My stomach was empty. I'd skipped lunch so I'd have an appetite for the family dinner. The guests drifted back into their conversations. Renee laughed at something Clifton said. Nadette was admiring another woman's bracelet. Wine poured. Silverware clinked against china. The room carried on as though nothing had occurred, because to them, nothing had. Just a difficult old man standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I fixed my eyes on the table, rather than Garrett's face, working to hold my composure, to keep the anger from rising to the surface the way Vera had always warned it would. You get this look, Lawton, like you're about to cross-examine someone. It scares people. There was a menu beside the nearest place setting. Cream cardstock, elegant and substantial, the kind that costs extra to print. The cover carried 3 words in gold lettering. Whitmore Heritage Dining. My hands went cold. Whitmore Heritage Dining. The name I'd been staring at for 4 weeks on my laptop screen at home. The independent insurance assessment file, Meridian Shield, had hired me to evaluate the development project, seeking an $18 million insurance package to secure a $6.4 million construction loan. I picked up the menu. My fingers left prints on the cream cardstock. Inside, the courses were listed in italicized script: pan-seared Dover sole with lemon beurre blanc, crab bisque, rosemary-crusted rack of lamb, dry-aged ribeye with porcini juice, vanilla panna cotta with edible gold flake. At the bottom, in smaller text, celebrating the launch of Whitmore Heritage Dining, Indianapolis's premier farm-to-table experience, opening spring 2022. My case. The file sitting on my desk at home, waiting for my final assessment report. The Project Meridian Shield had brought me in to evaluate independently because the loan amount triggered their standard fraud risk review protocol. 38 years investigating insurance fraud. I knew the patterns. High-value policies on new ventures, tangled ownership structures, aggressive timelines, projects that looked pristine on paper but felt wrong in the details. I'd spent a month working through Whitmore Heritage Dining, financial projections, ownership documents, construction contracts, searching for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the places where the numbers didn't hold together. And now I was standing in the middle of it. This was not a family dinner. It was a launch event, an investor presentation dressed up as a celebration. The 14 guests were not family. They were prospects. People with money sitting through Garrett's pitch eating expensive food, drinking wine that probably cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a week. I looked around the table with different eyes. The man in the gray suit who'd smiled into his wine mid-50s expensive watch manicured hands. The woman in Pearl's 60s designer dress, the composed posture of old money. Clifton Ardmore, whose fraudulent fire, claim I'd investigated 17 years ago, now seated at my son's investor table, as though that history had never happened. 3 words in gold lettering. Whitmore Heritage Dining. My case. The vest felt suddenly tight across my chest. The watch ticked against my ribs. Vera had chosen this vest for occasions that mattered. She'd said it made me look trustworthy. Trustworthy enough to compromise a professional assessment. Trustworthy enough to look the other way because family asked. Trustworthy enough to ruin. I stood there holding the menu, the gold lettering catching the candlelight. Whitmore Heritage Dining, the $18 million insurance package I'd been hired to assess independently. Inside my head, 38 years of professional instinct fired back to life all at once, like an engine turning over after a long silence. And I understood exactly why there had been no chair waiting for me tonight. Renee tapped her wine glass with a fork, and the lights dimmed as a projection screen descended behind her chair. I thank you all for joining our family tonight to celebrate this exciting milestone. Her voice carried the practiced warmth of someone who delivered this speech before. The Whitmore Heritage Dining expansion represents a unique opportunity for sophisticated investors who understand the premium hospitality market. I was still standing. My legs ached. The watch ticked in my vest pocket. The screen glowed to life with a polished logo. Whitmore Heritage Dining, in elegant script, above an illustration of a restored historic building. The first slide showed financial projections, revenue curves climbing steadily upward, profit margins highlighted in green. Our flagship location opens this spring. Renee continued advancing the slides with a small remote. We've secured prime real estate in the Fountain Square Arts District. 3 additional locations are planned for Louisville, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis by 2024. I studied the faces around the table. They weren't watching Renee the way family watches family. They were watching her the way investors watch a pitch. The man 2 seats to her left, early 50s, expensive suit tablet in front of him, was taking notes. Everett Colby, Regional Commercial Banking Director from Old National Bank. I recognized his face from business section coverage of commercial lending. The woman asking questions about occupancy projections was Vivienne Hartwell, a commercial real estate investor who specialized in hospitality properties. I'd seen her quoted in Indianapolis Business First, 2 men with crossed arms and visible calculators. Randall Osberg and his business partner, restaurant developers who had built 4 concepts across the Midwest. Regional banker, real estate investor, supply chain, representative, restaurant developers. These were not family friends. This was a curated investor table, and I was the 3-generation family unity prop. I understood it in one clear moment: the formal invitation, the expensive venue, the careful staging. Renee needed these investors to see a stable, multi-generational family enterprise. Grandfather, son, granddaughter, 3 generations united behind a vision. Except the grandfather was meant to stand quietly in the background, dignified but unobtrusive. A visual symbol of legacy and continuity without actually taking part in the polished presentation. The chair hadn't been removed to humiliate me. It had been removed to keep me away from the table, away from the conversation, away from looking like an equal participant who might ask inconvenient questions. I was decoration, an elderly prop positioned just far enough back to signal respectful distance. How long had they been planning this? Initial family investment has been substantial, Renee said, advancing to a slide listing capital contributions. Our founding partners bring both financial resources and industry expertise. Clifton Ardmore nodded along, looking every inch the successful investor he claimed to be. The man whose fraudulent insurance claim I'd investigated 17 years ago now sat at this table as a founding partner. His name on the slide, Clifton Raleigh Ardmore, principal investor, Whitmore. Clifton's middle name, now serving as the company's brand identity, Garrett's Project. Clifton's name, my son's work, his father-in-law's identity. My absence was complete. I stayed through the presentation. 30 more minutes of financial projections, market analysis, expansion timelines. 30 minutes of standing while my legs went numb and my anger turned cold. When dessert arrived, vanilla panna cotta with edible gold flake just as the menu had promised, I walked out. No one stopped me. I'm not sure anyone noticed. At home, I went straight to my study. The Meridian Shield file was still open on my laptop from that morning when I'd been reviewing it as a routine professional assessment, when I'd still thought it was just another job. Now I read it like an investigator. The project overview was impressive historic building renovation, farm to table concept, experienced management team. Everything looked legitimate on the surface. It always did. I scrolled to the financial appendix. Capital contributions, funding sources, ownership structure. The sections I always combed for inconsistencies. There it was, page 47, a table listing initial family investments. Clifton Raleigh Ardmore, $62,000, contributed 2012 to 2022. $62,000, the exact total I'd given Garrett over 10 years. I opened my personal records folder, found the file I kept for tax purposes, gifts to family members, properly documented. Because I was an investigator, and investigators kept clean records. 2012, $8,000 house down payment. 2013, $6,500 Ren's preschool tuition. 2014, $500 to $200 Garrett's first business loan payment. 2015, $700-800 car repair and insurance. 2016, $4,900 medical bills after Ren's appendicitis. 2017, $600 professional certification program. 2018, $300 pandemic assistance. 2020, $7,200 office equipment. 2020, $5,500 marketing costs. 2021, $3,800 legal fees. 2021, $1,700 year-end business expenses. Total $62,000. Every check written to help my son build his career. Every dollar given because he said cash flow was tight, because he was building something important, because family helps family. I went back to the Meridian Shield file and searched for my name, Lawton Devereaux. 0 results. I searched the transaction appendix, found the money trail. My checks had been deposited into Garrett's personal account, then transferred to a business account. then moved through 3 intermediary LLCs, then recorded as capital contributions from Clifton Ardmore, laundered. Not in the drug dealer sense, in the documentation sense. My money scrubbed clean of my name, reattributed entirely to Clifton. 10 years of fatherhood erased in one financial appendix. The pocket watch sat on my desk. I'd taken it from my vest pocket when I got home, set it down beside the laptop. It caught the desk lamp's light silver, and old and patient. I'd planned to give it to Garrett tonight. 4 generations of DeVroe men, now 5 a symbol of continuity and trust. Instead, I sat inside the lamp's circle of light, reading financial documents that proved my son had stolen from me. Not the money I'd given freely, but the credit, the acknowledgement, the basic recognition that I had helped build what he was now trying to sell. In the financial appendix, Clifton Ardmore's name appeared 17 times. Mine appeared 0. The silver pocket watch sat on the desk beside my right hand, still carrying warmth from my vest pocket an hour before, now permanently separate from me. And the next morning, someone would hand me the first piece of physical evidence that the chair removal had been scripted. The text arrived at 7:43 in the morning from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. DeVroe, this is Lena from Magnolia Terrace. I need to speak with you alone. I'd slept 3 hours, maybe less." The pocket watch still sat on my desk, where I'd left it catching the morning light through the study window. Evidence of what I had nearly given away. I sent her a time and place. She replied within seconds. Café Patachou, 3 blocks up from the restaurant. 30 minutes. When I got there, she'd already claimed a corner table, her back against the wall, watching the door. Lena read differently in the light of morning. Younger than I'd clocked her the night before, 28 maybe, wearing the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't found sleep in days. The kind of sleeplessness a guilty conscience manufactures. Before I'd settled into my seat, she pushed an envelope toward me across the table. Her fingers had a tremor to them. "I'm sorry about the chair," she said just above a whisper. The room around us was nearly vacant, but she spoke like someone afraid of being overheard. "I wanted to say something that night. I was scared I'd lose the job. I can't keep quiet anymore." I pulled open the envelope. Printed documents, screenshots, and at the bottom, a seating chart. 14 names set out around the Magnolia Terrace banquet table. Position 3, head table, right side. Lawton DeVroe, my name written into the original arrangement. "Your name was right there on the chart," Lena said, tapping it with one finger. "Right there. She sent me the text 3 hours before you showed up." She turned the page. A screenshot of a message thread. Renee's number at the top. Timestamp. 3:17 p.m. the day of the dinner. Remove Lawton DeVroe's chair before he arrives. Place the handbags in the 2 empty seats beside Clifton and Nadette. If he asks, tell him it's a system error and we're short on chairs tonight. Do not accommodate him unless I give direct approval. 10 minutes after that, a second message. If he makes a scene, we have documentation that the reservation was for 14 guests, not 15. Restaurant error, not our problem. I set the pages down. Evidence. A paper trail proving the humiliation had been drawn up in advance. "This isn't a family matter," I said to myself as much as to Lena. "This is evidence. She told me she'd made copies." "She doesn't know I'm here," Lena whispered. But I couldn't stay silent. "I've been in hospitality 6 years, Mr. DeVroe. What was done to you that night, that's not something we do. We don't engineer a man's degradation for sport." I studied her face across the table. 28 years old, gambling her livelihood, because something inside her refused to stay complicit. "Thank you," I told her. The words fell short of what she deserved. "Now that took real courage." "It took 4 days," she said. "Should have taken 4 minutes." At home that evening, I spread the Meridian Shield file across my desk again. The financial appendices I set aside. What I wanted now were the signature pages, the ownership filings, the incorporation records. Clifton Raleigh Ardmore, principal investor, Indianapolis, Indiana. Prior business address, Louisville, Indiana, 2006. I crossed to the file cabinet, the battered metal one, wedged in the corner of my study that Vera had always insisted made the room feel like a precinct office. In the back, the cases I'd archived from my working years, the ones that had never quite left me even after I'd stopped writing reports. 2006, Louisville Warehouse District, commercial fire, suspicious origin. I found the folder and pulled it free. Clifton Ardmore listed as the owner of Ardmore Commercial Properties. Claimed loss $2.3 million. My notes from that investigation typed on the old Brother electric typewriter I'd used before I retired. Burn patterns inconsistent with electrical fire. Inventory records show significant stock removal 2 weeks prior to incident. Claimant refused voluntary interview. Evidence suggests stage loss but insufficient documentation for prosecution. Recommend denial of claim. The insurer had paid out a fraction $800 to $1,000 because Clifton's attorney raised the threat of litigation, and the legal team had no appetite for a courtroom fight. Clifton shuttered the company, rebranded, and cleared out of Indiana before I had any opportunity to go deeper. 17 years. Then Clifton Raleigh stepped back into my world through my own son. That moment at Magnolia Terrace when our eyes landed on each other across the room, I'd read it wrong. That flicker wasn't recognition in the ordinary sense. It wasn't surprise at all. It was assessment. He'd known precisely who was coming through that door, the investigator who'd written up his 2006 claim, the one who'd put in notes that never reached a courtroom insufficient evidence to prosecute. He knew what I knew. And so, he'd arranged for me to be made small before I could start pulling at the threads around his daughter's venture. I had to have help, not official help, not reports filed, not channels notified. The kind of help that only comes from someone who has spent a career learning how money gets hidden, how corporate shells get stacked, how people bury what they don't want found. I called Celeste Pruitt. We met at Millie's Diner, the same booth we'd shared after investigations going back 20 years. Thick as ceramic mugs, steady coffee refills, no one caring how long you occupied a table. Celeste Pruitt. 6 Retired forensic auditor, had sat across from me on hundreds of cases. She listened to everything without a word of interruption. That measured stillness of hers, the absolute quiet attentiveness, had a way of making people talk just to escape it. When I reached the end of it, she let the silence hold for a moment. Then, Lawton, if what you're describing is accurate, this goes well beyond any family dispute. Elder financial exploitation, insurance fraud, document forgery. This isn't something you handle by yourself. I need someone working the money trail while I keep playing the role I've been assigned, I said. Someone who can move through corporate structures without anyone noticing. Someone whose name isn't going to trip any wires when they run it against the principal investor's daughter. Celeste looked at me steadily. Someone they have no idea is in the room. For the first time since that dinner, 4 days ago, I wasn't carrying this by myself. We split the assignment between us. Celeste would dig through the corporate architecture, trace cash movement, through the intermediary, LLCs, reconstruct the ownership map. I would go on performing my Meridian Shield assessment role, building the record of technical infractions, paperwork failures, insurance fraud indicators, and we'd hold our fire. No adverse report, not yet. Not before we knew how wide this thing actually stretched. Lawton, Celeste said as she got to her feet. She'd reached the diner's entrance when she stopped and turned back. Winter light came through the glass at a low angle laying across the parking lot behind her. The look on her face was one I recognized from the longest, most intricate fraud cases we'd ever worked together, measured unhurried biding time. I've never said this to you before in 20 years. I need you to slow down. Don't move on them before they've committed fully. Let every door swing open on its own. I knew precisely which doors she meant. One of them had already swung, pushed by someone I hadn't seen coming. 8 days after the dinner, my phone lit up. Vivian Hartwell tagged you in a video, Raleigh Heritage Celebration. There it was, the door Celeste had told me to watch for. Someone had posted footage online with no idea what they were handing me. I pulled it up on my laptop. Vivian Hartwell, the commercial real estate investor, who drilled pointed questions into the occupancy. Projections had shared a 3-minute clip with the note, "Exciting new venture in Indianapolis hospitality, thrilled to explore this opportunity." The footage held the banquet room from a single locked angle. Renee at the front walking through financial slides. Garrett beside her nodding at the right moments. The investors arranged attentively at their table, and off to the side, standing me. The camera had caught my position with precision. 30 minutes in one spot, and not a frame of it missed. I ran it back. Then again, I wasn't watching it the way a wounded father watches something that hurt him. I was watching it as a man who spent a career reading scenes. The angle was fixed from the first second to the last. Renee moved to a new slide the camera held. Someone in the room laughed the camera held. It never drifted toward any face, never followed any motion. It stayed exactly where someone had told it to stay, framing the patch of floor where I stood. Nobody records a memory that way. That's surveillance. Deliberate, practiced, unmoved by anything happening elsewhere in the room. Hired, positioned, given a single instruction. I went through Vivian's other tagged posts and found 2 more clips from separate guests. Everett Colby had put up a 10-second cut of Renee's opening remarks. Randall Osberg had shared a still from the dessert course. But the only video running past 60 seconds was the one trained on me, the one man in the room without a chair. I stopped the playback and held the frame. In the background behind the floral arrangement, the towering white peonies and olive branches partly blocking the view, there was a figure, dark clothes, a piece of equipment in his hands that was clearly not a phone. The sight lines matched exactly. They'd put someone in that room with one assignment: get my reaction on camera. If I'd raised my voice at Renee, if I'd shown fury when Lena tried to slide that chair back in, if I'd made any kind of scene, they would have had everything they needed. An old man unraveling in public. Emotional, erratic, not in command of himself. But I hadn't given them that. 38 years behind this work had built something in me, a reflex toward stillness, when the pressure rises toward watching rather than swinging toward trusting that quiet outlasts noise. Whatever they'd planned for step 1, my composure that night had quietly dismantled it. They needed me to blow up, I said, alone in my study. I didn't, so now they go to plan 2. I found myself wondering what plan 2 looked like. 2 days later, it showed up in my mailbox. An envelope, Marion County Probate Court, stamped in the corner, the official kind, the kind whose return address alone shifts the atmosphere in a room. I didn't wait to get inside. I stood at the end of the driveway in the March cold and tore it open. Notice of hearing in the matter of Lawton Devereaux, alleged incapacitated adult. The words took a moment to come into focus. I steadied the words until they held still on the page. Petitioner Garrett Devereaux alleges, Respondent Lawton. Devereaux, age 71, exhibits signs of paranoia, emotional volatility, and diminished capacity to manage financial assets. Petitioner requests appointment as limited guardian over respondent's financial affairs to protect respondent from exploitation and poor judgment. Hearing scheduled April 15, 2022, 5 weeks away. They had mapped every step of the calendar. Folded behind the notice, a 3-page affidavit bearing my son's signature. I read it where I stood, the March wind working at the edges of the pages. Garrett's account of the February 8th dinner was a work of careful fiction. I had arrived late, he wrote. I'd walked in precisely on time. I had behaved erratically. I had stood in silence for 30 minutes without incident. I had made inappropriate comments to other guests. I had barely spoken. I had left without saying goodbye. I had walked out after watching my daughter-in-law deliver an investor pitch dressed up as a family dinner. Every line was a refraction of what actually occurred. Each paragraph assembled a portrait of an unraveling man, one that would read as plausible to any judge who hadn't been in that room. An old man acting strangely at a gathering of relatives. A loving son alarmed by his father's decline. The affidavit pressed further. In recent months, I had shown increasing signs of paranoid ideation. I had grown consumed by unfounded conspiracy theories about family members. I had made baseless accusations of financial wrongdoing. My judgment was severely compromised. The translation was plain enough. I had begun to see the fraud clearly, and they were working to reclassify that clarity as mental deterioration. The final paragraph sought authority over my financial decisions, including, if deemed necessary, the sale of my primary residence to fund placement in an appropriate long-term care facility. They were after the house Vera and I bought in 1987. The house now worth $2.8 million because I'd chosen the neighborhood well and held it through 35 years of Indianapolis winters. The one asset Garrett could not touch, so long as I remained legally competent to govern my own affairs. The camera trap had failed. I'd been too composed that night, given them nothing on film they could use. So they had pivoted, not abandoning the dinner as evidence, but reframing it. No longer proof of volatility, now proof of strangeness. Same evening, different angle on the lens. The envelope shook in my grip, not from fear, from the kind of rage that takes 7 decades to compress into something that doesn't show on your face. That dinner had never been a celebration. It had never been a pitch for outside investors. It had been the opening act of this affidavit, a legal instrument designed to hand my son dominion over my accounts, my property, my right to determine the course of my own life. 5 weeks before a probate judge would rule on whether I was fit to run my own affairs. 5 weeks to demonstrate that recognizing fraud within your own family is not paranoia, it is pattern recognition. I stood at the mailbox in the afternoon light, the petition trembling in my hand, the March cold working through my coat. They had lost the footage they needed. They had moved to Plan B, and I was about to learn they had an accomplice neither of us had counted on someone small enough to have slipped past every wall they had constructed. My phone rang, number I didn't know. When I picked up, the voice on the other end was barely audible. "Grandpa, I only have a few minutes before Mom checks where I am." I was still in my car in the driveway. The guardianship petition lay on the passenger seat beside me. "Ren," I kept my voice level. "Where are you calling from?" "Emma's phone. Mom tracks mine." Her words tumbled out one after another. "Grandpa, I need to tell you something. I've been recording Mom and Dad on my old tablet. They think it's broken, but it still works. I've been doing it for months. 12 years old, recording her own parents because some instinct told her she had to. What did you hear?" I asked. "A lot of things I don't really understand. But last week her voice dropped so low, I had to press the phone harder against my ear. I heard Mom say that after they win the guardianship thing, they're going to sell your house and put you in a place called Lakeview Care. She said they need the money from the land for the restaurant project." Lakeview Care. I knew it, a budget-tier nursing facility on the east side of Indianapolis. Understaffed shared rooms. The sort of place families chose when they wanted someone managed rather than looked after. "Dad was there too," Ren went on. "He didn't say much, but he didn't stop her either. Grandpa, I don't understand all of it, but I know you're in danger." My granddaughter conducting her own covert operation at 12 because she had grasped without anyone telling her that something in her home had gone badly wrong. "Ren, are you safe?" "Yeah, Mom thinks I'm at Emma's doing homework. But Grandpa?" Her voice caught slightly. "Do you want me to bring you the tablet? I have maybe 6 months of recordings. Maybe more." 6 months, while I was sitting with her over science projects, buying her ice cream, on afternoons after school, she had been quietly building a record of what was being planned against me. "Not yet," I said, choosing each word. "Keep it hidden. Keep it somewhere safe. Don't tell anyone, not even Emma. Can you do that?" "Yes." I held a breath and looked for words that would honor what she'd done, without frightening her. "You did the right thing calling me. You're very brave." "I have to go. Emma's mom is calling us for dinner." A brief quiet on the line. "Grandpa, I love you. I love you too, sweetheart." The call ended. I sat in the driveway holding a phone that showed no record of the conversation, Ren's whispered voice still moving through the silence around me. A 12-year-old had found more courage than her own father. 2 days on, Celeste video called from her home office. Filing boxes rose in stacks behind her, the productive disorder of someone buried in a serious investigation. "Found something," she said, skipping the greeting entirely. "Company email system." Garrett and Renee route their communications through a private server, but they backed everything up to the main Raleigh Heritage account, probably for tax records. She shared her screen. An email interface filled the window. One message highlighted, Garrett DeVroe to Renee DeVroe. Celeste read it aloud. Sent January 12, 2022. Subject: family investment attribution. 3 weeks before the dinner. If the partners knew my father used to investigate commercial insurance fraud, they'd question the project's abnormal financial structure. His name needs to be wiped from all paperwork. We can reattribute his contributions through Clifton to avoid raising red flags during due diligence. Celeste stopped. The video call held its silence. I looked at the words on the screen, my son's words, typed in clean professional font. Not Renee's voice, not Clifton's direction, Garrett's own proposal. He had known exactly what my career meant in this context. He had understood that my background would cause investors to scrutinize the project's structure, and rather than address that structure, he had chosen to make me disappear from the paperwork entirely. January 12th, I said. I was helping Ren with her science project that evening. He came by around 9, stayed for dinner. We talked about the project. He said it was going well. He looked me in the eye. That night, I said. My voice came out sounding like it belonged to someone else. Called me Dad. Hugged me at the door. And 3 hours later, I checked the timestamp on the screen at 2:47 a.m. He wrote this email proposing to erase my credibility so his fraudulent project could survive due diligence. Celeste's face on the screen wore the expression I remembered from the hardest cases we'd ever worked. The look that came over her when the fraud stopped being financial and turned personal, when the evidence showed that someone had deliberately betrayed the people who loved them most. "I'm sorry," she said, quietly. I had kept telling myself a story, that Renee had pulled him into this, that Clifton's history had shaped the scheme, that my son was in some way a casualty of other people's ambition or criminal design. I pressed back into my desk chair and felt all 71 years settling into my bones. He wasn't pulled, he chose it. But there's more in the email, Celeste said. He lays out the entire plan, camera placement at the dinner, a record of erratic behavior to be constructed, the guardianship filing schedule. Lawton, your son, built this. January 12th, sent at 2:47 a.m., 3 weeks before he stood at my door and called me Dad. "What else did you find?" I asked. Still working through the corporate structures. There are layers, shell companies, ownership transfers. I think she paused. I think there's something underneath it. Something even Garrett may not be aware of. "Keep digging." "I will, Lawton." She waited until I met her eyes through the screen. "You know this can't stay just the two of us, not with the hearing 5 weeks out." "I'm not alone," I said. "I have you. And I have a 12-year-old granddaughter who has outrun every adult in this situation for courage." Celeste gave a slow nod. "Tell me when you're ready to bring in legal help. We'll need it before long." "Agreed, but not yet. You said it yourself, let every door open on its own first." After she logged off, I sat in front of the dark screen. The timestamp wouldn't leave me. January 12th, 2022, 2:47 a.m. Garrett hadn't been shaped by Renee. He had been the architect. He'd been the architect. And somewhere across Indianapolis, a 12-year-old girl was hiding a tablet loaded with recordings her own father didn't know existed. But Garrett's betrayal was only one layer, because Renee had been running a plan even he knew nothing about. The encrypted email hit my inbox at 6:41 in the morning, subject line enough to turn my stomach cold. VWH Holdings. She'd been at this since November. I opened it at my desk, coffee sitting untouched next to the keyboard. Celeste's corporate trace report filled the screen pages of legal documents, ownership chains, transfer agreements. VWH Hospitality. Holdings LLC, registered November 8, 2021. Principal owner, Renee Page Devroe. November, 3 months before the Magnolia Terrace dinner. 4 months before Garrett filed the guardianship petition. I scrolled through the attachments: operating agreement, intellectual property transfer documents, licensing contracts. Every page said the same thing, dressed in legal language: upon project funding, all intellectual property branding rights, recipes, supplier contracts, and operating licenses transfer automatically to VWH Hospitality Holdings. Garrett Devroe listed as director. No ownership stake, no voting rights, no say in anything. My son had spent 3 years building a restaurant concept, and the moment it drew funding, he'd own nothing. Celeste's notes ran in red text at the bottom of the report. Document metadata shows creation from IP address 122.168.147. Renee's home computer per ISP records. Timestamp: November 8th, 2021, 2:00 a.m. Garrett's computer was offline at that hour. While Garrett slept beside her, Renee was drafting the legal instruments that would take everything he'd built. I kept reading. The transfer agreements were automatic, no further signatures required from Garrett after the initial operating agreement. He'd signed his own disposal order, buried in paragraph 17 of a 40-page corporate document, probably told it was standard legal protection. Renee had been planning to cut Garrett loose from the start. He believed they were partners conspiring against me. He had no idea he was already a piece on her board, already marked for sacrifice. November 8th. 0 a.m. While he slept beside her, she was already engineering his removal. The bitter irony wasn't hard to see. My son had chosen to betray his father, and his wife had chosen to betray him. We were both casualties of Renee's game, just at different stages of it. But mapping the betrayal didn't change what I had to do. It only sharpened the picture. I had an appointment that afternoon at Meridian Shield's office. Hector Faulkner, the fire safety engineer they had brought in for a technical review of the Raleigh Heritage Project, had asked to walk through the building plans with me. Hector was 58, methodical, the kind of man who'd given 30 years to making sure buildings didn't kill people. He spread the blueprints across the conference table and put his finger on 3 dates that made no structural sense. "Mr. Devroe, these inspection dates are impossible. His finger moved along the sprinkler system diagram. The sprinkler inspection is logged as February 1st, but the construction permit shows second floor framing wasn't completed until February 18th. You cannot inspect a system that hasn't been installed yet. I leaned over the table. The dates were right there in print. Official looking, stamped and signed. Could be a clerical error. I said, though, I already knew it wasn't. Could be. Hector turned to the signature page. Accept this signature, Clement Dravecki, P.E., I know Clem. We worked side by side for 20 years. He retired in 2020. Someone pulled his digital signature off an old file. Forged documents, impossible dates, stolen credentials. Who submitted these to Meridian Shield? I asked. Hector pulled up the submission record. Weston Burrell, listed as project safety coordinator. Weston Burrell, Garrett's close friend from college. No engineering background, no safety certifications. Just a name on paperwork and 8% equity according to the ownership structure Celeste had traced. 8% of a fraudulent project in exchange for signing off on false safety reports using a stolen signature. What happens if this system fails? I asked, keeping my voice level. Hector's expression turned grave. The second floor dining area seats around 90 people. Main floor holds another 110. If fire breaks out upstairs and the sprinkler system doesn't respond correctly, he stopped. Indiana Fire Code requires specific spacing water pressure and activation timing. This configuration fails on all three. How bad? In an actual fire. Hector looked straight at me. People die, Mr. Devereaux. That's how bad. 200 capacity. Families marking anniversaries. Parents bringing children out for a special meal. Elderly couples savoring an evening at a premium restaurant. All of them trusting that someone had verified their safety. I stopped being a betrayed father and became what I'd been for 38 years, an investigator whose job was protecting the innocent. I need you to document every violation, I said. Every impossible date, every forged signature, every code failure. Official report, your professional seal dated and witnessed. You're going to reject the insurance application, Hector said. It wasn't a question. I'm going to do more than that. I looked at the blueprint spread across the table, at Weston Burrell's forged name, at the foot of the safety certification. But I need airtight documentation first. Hector gave a slow nod. I'll have it ready by Friday, Mr. Devereaux. He paused. I've been in this field 30 years. I've seen corners cut, rules bent, inspectors paid off. But forging a retired engineer's credentials to certify a system that violates basic fire code, that's not cutting corners. That's premeditated negligence. Yes, that's fraud, I said. The kind that gets people killed. I drove home with the blueprints in my trunk. Hector's red-marked corrections laid over the fraudulent safety files. The March afternoon was cold sky, the color of ash weather that matched what was sitting in my chest. This wasn't about stolen money anymore. It wasn't about my son's betrayal or my daughter-in-law's schemes. It was about 200 people who would walk through a restaurant door, trusting that someone had done their job, that someone had checked whether the systems would hold, that someone had decided their lives were worth protecting. Weston Burrell's forged signature stared up at me from the passenger seat. 8% equity in exchange for putting 200 lives at risk. This had stopped being family drama a long time ago. And I was about to learn that Clifton and Nadette were carrying their own secrets, ones that reached back to a warehouse fire 17 years ago. The text came from a block number at 9:17 that night. Meyer parking lot tomorrow, 4:0 p.m., north corner, come alone. I have information about Clifton you need. I'd spent the day going through Hector's fire safety documentation, absorbing the fact that this conspiracy wasn't just about taking money. It was about building a death trap. Now, someone wanted a parking lot meeting with information about the man whose warehouse fire I'd investigated 17 years earlier. I went alone. The Meyer on Henderson Road was busy at 4 in the afternoon, shoppers ferrying groceries, children buckled into car seats, ordinary people moving through ordinary lives. I pulled into the north corner and waited. A pewter Cadillac pulled up alongside me 2 minutes later. The driver's window came down. Nadette Ardmore sat behind the wheel in dark sunglasses despite the flat, overcast sky. Mr. Devereaux. She didn't look at me directly, kept her gaze ahead as though we were having a conversation that wasn't taking place. Thank you for coming. I rolled my window down. What do you know about Clifton? He's leaving. Her voice was flat stripped of feeling. June 20th, one-way ticket to Panama. I found it in his desk drawer while he was out. Panama, no extradition treaty with the United States for most financial crimes. He moved money, Nadette continued. $380,000 to an account I didn't know existed offshore. I found the bank statements yesterday. She reached through the window gap and pressed a small leather-bound notebook into my hand. I took it carefully, as if it might go off. What's this? These were every transaction I could track over the past 6 months. Wire transfers, shell company payments, dates, amounts, account numbers. She finally turned and looked at me, and her face had a hardness I hadn't seen at the dinner. He's been moving money in a pattern, building his way out, constructing his escape. I opened the notebook. Nadette's handwriting covered page after page, neat, precise, methodical. Dates, dollar figures, routing numbers. The record of someone who'd been watching her husband with great care. Why bring this to me, Nadette? She was quiet for a long beat. Shoppers drifted past, pushing carts, entirely unaware of what was unfolding between 2 cars in a parking lot corner. Because he was about to leave me behind with all of it, she said finally. The debts, the fraud investigation, everything. I'm not doing this for Justice Lawton. I'm doing it to protect myself. Honest, at least. Brutal and self-serving, but honest. You understand what this notebook means, I said. Evidence against your husband, potentially against your daughter too. Renee made her choices. Nadette's voice didn't shift. And Clifton made his when he bought a one-way ticket without telling the woman he'd been married to for 40 years. I took the notebook from a woman who'd chosen her own survival over her husband's, knowing full well I was no cleaner than she was, using tainted evidence to fight a tainted scheme. If anyone asks where you got this, Nadette started. You were never here, I finished. This conversation didn't happen. What I was about to uncover wasn't just a betrayal, it was a blueprint, drawn up carefully by someone I should have been able to trust completely. Before we get there, I want to ask you if you discovered that someone close to you had been quietly working against you from the very beginning. Would you confront them directly, or would you let the evidence do the talking? She gave a single nod, rolled her window up, and pulled away. I stayed in that parking lot holding a leather-bound notebook, packed with Clifton's financial secrets, turning over the same question: how many people in this conspiracy were already planning to cut each other loose before it was over? 3 days later, I met Celeste at our usual diner. She had that look, the one she got when she'd turned up something significant. Excited and grim in equal measure, she pushed a printed document across the table before I'd even thought about ordering coffee. A professional property appraisal dated 2 weeks prior, my address at the top. Your land isn't worth $240,000, Lawton. Celeste pressed a finger to the bolded figure at the page's bottom. It's worth $2.8 million. I stared at that number. $2,800,000. That's not possible, I said. The house is old. The neighborhood is the Indianapolis Logistics Expansion Corridor. Celeste cut me off. A major distribution company has been quietly acquiring parcels in your area for the past year. Your property sits directly in the development path. Prime commercial real estate. $2.8 million. The house Vera and I had bought in 1987 for $82,000. Garrett believes it's worth $240,000, I said slowly. That's the figure he put in the guardianship petition. Estimated asset value. I know. Celeste pulled out another document, printed emails. And Renee has known the real number since December. Look at this. The chain showed correspondence between Renee and a man named Harlan Vesper, a commercial real estate broker. December 18th, 2021. Subject line: Indianapolis Distribution, Corridor Properties. Harlan's message laid out purchase offers in the area, listed recent comparable sales, and included a professional estimate for my property, $2.8 million pending rezoning approval. Renee's reply was brief. Don't contact the owner directly. I'll handle acquisition through alternative channels. Alternative channels, I repeated. Guardianship, Celeste said. She was going to seize control through the court order, sell the property through an intermediary she controls, and pocket the difference. $2.6 million that Garrett would never know existed. $2,800,000, my old house, the one Garrett grew up in, where Vera planted her flowers in the back garden, where we'd held 35 years of birthday parties and holiday dinners. Renee had been planning to take it since December, 3 months before the Magnolia Terrace dinner. 2 months before she smiled at me and said I only deserved to gnaw on leftover bones. She was betraying Garrett the whole time, I said, even before she came after me. The VWH Holdings shell company, the IP transfer documents, now this. Celeste ticked them off on her fingers. Renee has been running at least 3 separate schemes at the same time. One against you, one against Garrett, one against the investors. And Clifton is running from all of it with a ticket to Panama while Nadette saves herself by handing you his financial records. Celeste leaned back in the booth. Lawton, this family is devouring itself. I sat in that diner, the appraisal report in front of me, $2.8 million printed in bold. Renee had known that figure since December. 3 months before the dinner, 2 months before, she stood at Magnolia Terrace and told me I didn't need a good seat. She'd understood exactly what she was taking when she smiled and welcomed me in. And now, I face the hardest decision of my investigative life. How long do you let people keep digging before you bury them? Celeste spread the timeline across my kitchen table and asked the question I'd been sidestepping for 3 weeks. Why haven't you submitted the unfavorable assessment report yet? April morning light came through the windows. Coffee sat between us, going cold. The evidence folders were stacked to my left. Lena's seating chart, Clifton's offshore notebook, Renee's shell company documents, Hector's fire safety violations. The property appraisal showing $2.8 million. Everything required to bring down the Raleigh Heritage Project was on that table, and I hadn't delivered a single page to Meridian Shield. Strategy, I said. Celeste waited. 20 years of working investigations together had taught her when I was still thinking something through. If I file the unfavorable report tomorrow, I continued, Clifton has time to wipe the digital trail and board that Panama flight. Renee pins the whole thing on Garrett and claims she was deceived. The fraud investigation bogs down because the key players vanish before law enforcement can build corroborating evidence. I pulled up the email on my phone and held out the screen. But if we hold until June 8th, Renee has a meeting scheduled at Magnolia Terrace with all the investors. She's calling it a critical funding decision session. Everett Colby from the bank will be there. Vivian Hartwell and Randall Osberg. Everyone who sat at that table while I stood. And Meridian Shield's underwriter attends major funding meetings for projects of this size. I'll be in that room as the independent assessor. I set the phone down. If we wait until June 8th, when the bank is present, when every investor is present, when the insurance officials are in the room, we expose it all in a single moment before any of them can scatter. Celeste studied me from across the table. You're still investigating, Lawton. You never stopped. This isn't about revenge. It's about building an airtight case. 38 years taught me something, I said. The strongest fraud cases aren't the ones where you catch someone mid-act. They're the ones where you let them finish constructing the whole thing, document every step, and then lay the complete picture in front of a jury. Incomplete fraud investigations give smart lawyers room to argue intent was never established. So you're letting them keep going. I'm letting them expose themselves completely. I tapped the timeline. Every wire transfer Clifton makes between now and June adds another count. Every email Renee sends about the shell company is more evidence. Every day Garrett operates the project with forged safety documents is another violation. 38 years taught me the best trap is the one they build for themselves. The guardianship hearing is in 2 weeks, Celeste said quietly. April 15th. Are you prepared for that? I have Lena's testimony, Hector's safety report, the property appraisal, and Ren. I paused, thinking of my 12-year-old granddaughter with 6 months of recordings on a cracked tablet. Ren has her own attorney now. She'll testify if it comes to that. That's going to destroy Garrett. Garrett destroyed himself when he wrote that email at 2:47 in the morning. My voice came out harder than I'd meant it to. I'm just making certain the court sees what he chose to build. The following week, Celeste called while I was sitting in my car. She'd been reviewing files at the Meridian Shield office, keeping up the role of independent assessor who knew nothing beyond the technical documents. I verified everything Nadette gave you. Celeste said no preamble. $380 transferred to a Cayman account on March 4th. One-way ticket Panama City June 20th at 6:15 a.m. June 20th. I ran the arithmetic. 5 days after the loan disbursement deadline. June 15th was when the bank would release funds if the project gained approval. Clifton had timed it to the day. If the project got funded, he'd take his cut and disappear. If it didn't, the offshore account was still sitting there. I was in my driveway, engine off, phone to my ear. 17 years ago, Clifton Ardmore had walked away from a fraudulent warehouse fire because I couldn't prove intent, couldn't establish the systematic pattern, couldn't demonstrate to the court that every detail had been deliberate. Not this time. I'm reporting it to the federal authorities, I said. Not to stop him yet, just to make sure they're watching. A neighbor went past with a dog completely indifferent to the conversation taking place inside a car parked in an ordinary driveway. If I flagged the Panama flight now, they could monitor without acting. They wouldn't move before June 8th, Bull, but when the moment came, they'd ensure he was still in the country. Celeste was quiet for a beat. You've been planning this for weeks. I've been planning this since I saw his name in the Meridian Shield file and remembered Louisville 2006. The anger I'd been holding down for 3 months ran just beneath my voice. Clifton thought 17 years was enough for me to let it go, enough for statutes to shield him, enough for the past to stay buried. And now I have evidence he couldn't erase, a paper trail he didn't know about, and a June 20th reservation that proves he understood exactly what he was doing, because people who haven't done anything wrong don't buy one-way tickets to Panama 5 days after a loan deadline. 17 years, and this time I had him. I called the federal fraud tip line that afternoon. I gave them Clifton's name, the offshore account number from Nadette's notebook, the flight details, the connection to the Meridian Shield insurance application. They took everything down, opened a file, issued a case number. No arrests, no warrants, just monitoring, watching, and waiting. Exactly what I needed. I sat in my car call, ended federal tip, submitted. June 8th was 63 days away. Clifton's one-way ticket sat in a Panama Airlines reservation system, June 20th. 6:15 a.m., a flight he would never board, because this time I wasn't the investigator who'd lost evidence to procedural gaps and well-funded lawyers. I was the one holding every card, tracking every move, waiting for the precise moment when all the pieces landed in position. And in 2 weeks, those cards would play out in a Marion County courtroom, where Garrett believed he'd walk away with guardianship, never suspecting that his own daughter was about to testify against him. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected. Old oak tables, narrow windows letting in filtered April light, and Judge Bertram Quill already settled behind the bench, peering over his bifocals at the guardianship petition with visible skepticism. 2 weeks had passed since I'd reported Clifton's Panama flight to the federal authorities. Now, I sat beside Alden Northrup, my attorney, a specialist in elder law and exploitation cases, watching Garrett and Renee come through the opposite door with their legal team. Garrett wouldn't meet my eyes. Renee's face was composed flawless, the same expression she'd worn at Magnolia Terrace when she told me I deserved to gnaw on bones. Judge Quill, a silver-haired probate judge with 32 years on the Marion County bench, peered over his bifocals with an expression I recognized from my own career. The look of a professional who has already caught the scent of something rotten. Garrett's attorney stood and smoothed his tie. Your Honor, we submit video evidence from the February 8th family event demonstrating the respondent's erratic and volatile behavior. The bailiff dimmed the lights. The same footage Vivian Hartwell had posted online played across the screen, me standing beside the table at Magnolia Terrace while 14 people sat and ate. I watched the judge's face as it played, watched his eyebrows climb when the audio caught Renee's voice, clear as a bell. I only deserved to gnaw on leftover bones from everyone's plates. Watched his expression harden when Lena moved to bring a chair and Renee stopped her in front of the assembled guests. The footage ran on. The camera angle never shifted, locked on the corner where I stood waiting for me to erupt, to hand them the volatile behavior they needed. Except I'd stayed quiet, controlled, watching. Judge Quill stopped the video midway through. Counselor, what this footage shows is your client's wife insulting the respondent and your client failing to provide his own father a chair. I'm not observing volatility. I'm observing deliberate humiliation. Garrett's attorney opened his mouth, then closed it. Your Honor, the context, the judge cut in, appears to be that the allegedly incompetent individual showed extraordinary restraint under public provocation. Continue with your remaining evidence. There wasn't much. Garrett's affidavit alleging paranoid behavior on my part. A letter claiming I'd made baseless accusations against family members. Then it was our turn. Dr. Sylvia Voss took the witness stand first. The court-appointed independent physician who had administered my cognitive evaluation the week before arrived carrying a thick file of test results. I conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment of Mr. Devereaux, she testified. His MMSE score is 29 out of 30. His executive function is excellent, and he demonstrated clear command of complex financial matters. There is no evidence whatsoever of diminished capacity. In your professional opinion, Alden asked, does Mr. Devereaux require a guardian? Absolutely not. Dr. Voss's tone was unequivocal. He is cognitively intact, financially literate, and entirely capable of managing his own affairs. Across the room, I watched my son's face as his own evidence dismantled him. Lena Caswell testified next. She looked nervous in the witness box, hands folded tight in her lap, but her voice held. Ms. Caswell, Alden said you were the event coordinator at Magnolia Terrace Restaurant on February 8th. Or, yes. Can you describe the seating arrangements for that evening? Lena produced the printed seating chart. The original plan placed Lawton Devereaux at the head table position 3. His name was on the chart I prepared 3 days before the event. What happened to that chair? I received text messages from Renee Devereaux. Lena raised the printed screenshots, her hands trembling slightly. These arrived 3 hours before Mr. Devereaux was due to arrive. Remove his chair. Put handbags there instead. If he complains, blame a computer error. The judge took the documents and read them carefully. His jaw tightened. And did you follow those instructions? Alden asked. Yes. Lena's voice fell. I removed his chair as directed. I placed designer handbags in the empty seats. And when I tried to bring him a folding chair, Ms. Devereaux stopped me in front of all the guests. Thank you, Ms. Caswell. Then Audra Pelham stood, a family law attorney, appointed to represent Wren's interests independent of both parties. She approached the bench carrying a small tablet and a manila envelope. Your Honor, my 12-year-old client has provided audio recordings covering a 4-month period. In them, her parents explicitly discuss obtaining guardianship, selling Mr. Devereaux's property, placing him in Lakeview Care Facility, and using the proceeds to cover project capital shortfalls. The judge took the tablet and listened through headphones for 5 minutes. I watched his face move from skepticism to something harder. My 12-year-old granddaughter had just testified against her own father to protect me. I've heard enough, Judge Quill said, finally removing the headphones. He set his bifocals on the bench and looked squarely at Garrett. Mr. Devereaux, I want to be unambiguous about something. Guardianship is a serious legal mechanism designed to protect vulnerable adults from exploitation. It is not an instrument for seizing a parent's assets to cover business shortfalls. Garrett sat rigid. Renee's face had gone chalk white. This petition is dismissed in its entirety. The judge's voice carried the weight of 3 decades behind that bench. Furthermore, I am referring all materials in this matter to Marion County Adult Protective Services for immediate investigation of elder financial exploitation. Alden put a hand on my shoulder, a small, quiet acknowledgement of what had just happened. Let me be entirely clear, Judge Quill continued, leaning forward. This is not a minor family disagreement. Based on the evidence presented, premeditated humiliation, documented conspiracy to obtain guardianship through false pretenses, planning to institutionalize a competent adult against his will, and schemes to misappropriate property, this is a potential criminal matter. He reached for his gavel. Adult Protective Services will conduct a full investigation. If they develop evidence of financial exploitation or fraud, the matter will be referred to the Marion County Prosecutor's Office. Do you understand, Mr. Devereaux? Garrett nodded, mute. The gavel struck once, final absolute. The guardianship petition was dismissed. Adult Protective Services would now open a formal criminal investigation into elder financial exploitation. Garrett sat frozen at his table. Renee's face remained chalk white. And I understood this wasn't simply a legal victory. It was the first domino in a chain that would end on June 8th. Outside the courtroom in the hallway, where no one else could hear, Garrett was about to learn something that would finish whatever was left of his marriage. He stepped directly in front of my car before I could back out of the courthouse parking space, rain beginning to darken his jacket, and asked the question I'd been waiting for. What is VWH Hospitality Holdings? I put the car in park. Through the windshield, I could see his face, exhausted, beaten, reaching for an answer he already knew. I rolled the window down. Rain tapped against the glass. VWH Hospitality Holdings is the company your wife formed in November, I said. All intellectual property, all branding, all licenses transfer to that entity upon funding. You're listed as director, with zero ownership, zero voting rights, zero control. She was planning to drop you the moment the money cleared. Garrett didn't move. The rain intensified, soaking through his jacket, running down his face. He stood there in the parking lot as if he'd forgotten how to take a step. Then he lowered himself onto the courthouse steps, wet granite rain streaming down the stone, and buried his face in his hands. I got out of my car and stood a few feet off, watching my son understand that his wife had betrayed him as completely as he had betrayed me. Do you know what I gave up over the last 10 years, Garrett? Or Spinpor, El Wanderer. He nodded without lifting his head. And you erased my name from everything I handed you. I know. His voice was barely there beneath the sound of the rain. I waited for an explanation, an apology, anything. Nothing came. The guardianship petition failed, I said, but Adult Protective Services will investigate. The fraud case is coming, whether you cooperate or not. Clifton is already planning to leave the country. Nadette is cooperating to save herself. And Renee? I paused. Renee was never on your side, Garrett. She was using you from the start. He finally looked up. Rain ran down his face, and I couldn't say for certain whether he was crying or whether it was just the weather. I know, he said again. The rain fell harder. I got back in my car and watched my son sitting on those courthouse steps in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. Days later, I met with Alden Northrup at his law office. Celeste was there, along with Conrad Elway Meridian Shield Insurance's senior compliance officer who had overseen my independent assessment contract. Ms. Devereaux contacted us yesterday. Conrad reached into his briefcase and laid a stack of printed correspondence on the table. She wants you off the project conflict of interest, she called it. What did you say? I asked. That your contract is active and your final report hasn't been filed. Until that report lands, you're the assessor of record. He pushed the pages toward me. She did not take that well. I read through Renee's written reply. Formal phrasing but rage just underneath it, bias allegations, warnings of litigation. She's booked an emergency investor meeting for June 8th at Magnolia Terrace, Conrad went on, trying to push the project across the finish line without your blessing. Her pitch to the investors is that the insurance review is a rubber stamp inconsequential. Can she actually do that? Celeste asked. Hold the meeting, certainly, Conrad said. Fund the project. No, the bank won't move money without an insurance sign-off, and that sign-off requires a favorable finding from the contracted evaluator. I turned to Alden. Can we compel Meridian Shield and the bank to put people in that room on June 8th? Compel is exactly the right word, Alden said. If she's delivering a project status presentation to investors, the insurer and the lender aren't just welcome, they have standing to demand a seat. Then we show up in force, I said. Meridian Shield, the Bank Adult Protective Services, if they'll come and I deliver my full assessment in front of every party that matters. Investors, lenders, insurers, all in one room. Nobody gets a head start running. Conrad was quiet for a moment, turning it over. The fire safety violations by themselves would sink this project. But layer in the forged credentials, the shell company scheme, the offshore transfers. He set down his pen. Mr. Devereaux, what you've compiled isn't just grounds to deny coverage. It's a fraud case. Yes, I said, which is exactly why it has to land on all of them at the same moment. About 2 weeks after the courthouse, late April, Garrett showed up at my door unannounced. He came in, opened his laptop on the kitchen table, and angled the screen so I could read it. Email chains, VWH Holdings, corporate formation records, transfer agreements. Everything he'd turned up on his own after I'd spoken to him in the parking lot. I pulled all of it myself, he said, voice low. The whole VWH structure, everything that was buried in the corporate filings. He paused. If I come forward and cooperate with prosecutors, do you think that buys me anything on sentencing scores? I didn't respond right away. I walked to the bedroom and took the silver pocket watch from the vest pocket. The vest, Vera had picked out the one I'd worn to Magnolia Terrace 4 months earlier. The watch I'd intended to pass to Garrett that night. I came back and placed it on the table between us. Do you recall why I meant to give you that watch at Magnolia Terrace? Garrett's eyes dropped to the silver case light, catching the cover. He nodded. That watch goes to a man who stands behind his word, Garrett. I pulled out the chair across from him and sat. It's traveled through 4 generations. My great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and then me. I was ready to hand it forward because I thought you grasped the weight of that. The watch lay between us on the table, 4 generations, and the chain might stop here. I can't give it to you yet, I said. He raised his eyes and held mine the first time he'd done that since the courthouse steps. I know. He sat with that for a moment, then reached into his jacket. I have to call my attorney. I leaned against the counter while the line rang on speaker. His lawyer, a criminal defense man he'd retained the previous week, picked up. I want to discuss cooperating with the federal case, Garrett said. Steady, flat, resigned. Elder financial exploitation insurance fraud, forged documents. I can provide evidence and I'm prepared to testify. The attorney's voice filtered back through the phone, small and professional, walking him through immunity frameworks, sentencing considerations, cooperation mechanics. Garrett met each question without flinching, the tone of someone closing a business deal, not negotiating his own fate. The watch didn't move from the table, ungiven. It would wait to see what kind of man my son chose to become. 43 days later, everyone who mattered assembled at Magnolia Terrace for the last time. June 8th landed with the finality of a deadline. The morning was warm, the sky clear, the sort of weather that gives Indianapolis an unearned sense of confidence about the season ahead. I entered the Magnolia Terrace banquet room for only the second time in my life, and I did not walk in alone. Celeste Pruitt came in at my side. Behind us, Everett Colby from Old National Bank, Conrad Elway from Meridian Shields Insurance Alden Northrop, and Hector Faulkner with a briefcase full of blueprints marked in red. The room was the same ivory linen crystal stemware, towering white peonies and olive branches in the centerpieces, but its purpose had changed. A projection screen stood at one end, name placards lined the table, water pitchers and coffee were set along the wall. Renee was near the head of the table, speaking quietly with Vivian Hartwell and Randall Osberg, 2 of the investors from the February dinner. She glanced up as we walked in, and something crossed her face just for a half second before the practiced composure returned. Well, Lawton, she made sure the room could hear it. Looks like you finally got yourself a seat. I stopped. I looked at her without blinking. Renee. I said I never wanted your seat. I only needed everyone present to understand what you did with mine. The composure fractured. A staff member was already drawing back the chair at the center of the long table, the assessor's position, with a placard, Lawton Devroe, Meridian Shield Insurance. I sat down in it. Not a seat extended as charity. The seat my 38-year professional record had earned, ratified by contract, beyond anything Renee's text messages could touch. Garrett was 3 chairs to my left next to his wife. He looked like a man running on no sleep. Clifton and Nadette sat on the opposite side. Clifton held himself carefully, too carefully, and the strain showed in the set of his jaw. Everett Colby anchored the far end. Conrad Elway settled in beside me. Vivian Hartwell, Randall Osberg, and 2 others from the February gathering filled the remaining seats. Every place was taken now, and every person in those places was about to learn exactly what their money had funded. I stood. Good morning. I'm Lawton Devroe, engaged by Meridian Shield as the independent insurance assessor for the Raleigh Heritage Dining Project. I'm here to deliver my findings in full. The remote clicked. The screen lit Meridian Shield logo, my name beneath it. Over these past 4 months, I've examined every dimension of this project. The insurance application ownership architecture, financial records, and compliance with building safety codes. I move to the next slide. The picture that emerges is not a collection of isolated oversights. It is systematic fraud operating on multiple tracks. Renee's color drained. Clifton didn't move a muscle. I was sitting in the seat they had denied me 4 months ago. Not as someone's wounded father, but as the examiner holding documented proof of what they had built. Capital structure first. The slide showed Renee's submissions to Meridian Shield. Clifton Ardmore's stated investment, $1.2 million, recorded as principal investor, founding partner. I clicked forward. Bank records took over the screen. Verified cash actually held in the Raleigh Heritage corporate account. That morning, $34,000. Creditor claims outstanding against the entity, $127,000 in unpaid obligations. Vivian Hartwell's posture shifted. Randall Osberg turned and said something low to the person beside him. Where did the $1.2 million go? Everett Colby asked from the far end. It went nowhere. I said, because it never arrived. The documentation recording that investment is fabricated. Clifton pushed his chair back and rose. "This is slander. You're tearing a man's reputation apart in front of Mr. Ardmore." Everett's voice came down like a blade. "Sit down. The assessor has the floor, and no funding decision gets made until his complete report is on the table." Clifton sat. His hands found the table edge and gripped it. I advanced the slide. The $62,000 entered into the books as a Raleigh family capital contribution, attributed to Clifton Ardmore, requires its own examination. A timeline expanded across the screen wire, transfers account numbers, a trail running from 2012 through 2022. What this actually represents is a decade of financial transfers from me to my son, Garrett DeVroe. I kept my delivery measured, unhurried. A down payment on his home, 2012. Private school tuition for my granddaughter, 2014 through 2021. Startup funding, 2017. Medical costs, 2016. Every transfer is traceable to my signature, my account, my routing numbers. I clicked once more. The screen filled with flow diagrams, arrows threading money out of my account into Garrett's, then into a business account, then through 3 shell LLCs before it surfaced in Raleigh Heritage's ledgers. Scrubbed through intermediary accounts to disguise its origin. I pressed on funds rerouted under Clifton Ardmore's name. My own name appears nowhere in the documentation Renee submitted to Meridian Shield for insurance approval. 10 years of being a father. $62,000. Scrubbed, relabeled, and stolen, laid out now on a projection screen with timestamps for a room full of witnesses. Garrett kept his eyes on his hands. He'd known this slide was coming. We'd gone through the presentation together 3 days earlier during his cooperation sessions with the prosecutors. But there's a distance between knowing something in a private office and watching it displayed in front of bankers, investors, and insurance officials. Renee had moved from pale to ashen. She drew a breath to speak, and Conrad raised one hand. "Let him finish," Conrad said without raising his voice. "All of it." I moved to the next slide. Wire transfer records 2012 through 2022. Every dollar traced through 3 intermediary accounts before it surfaced in Raleigh Heritage's ledgers under Clifton Ardmore's name. Every transaction accounted for. Every LLC in the chain identified. Every signature cross-referenced. Every timestamp intact. Clifton sat, rigid eyes fixed on the screen. And then I saw it, the expression I'd watched cross his face in Louisville 17 years ago, when evidence had begun tightening around a warehouse fire claim. The moment just before he dissolved, his company adopted a new name and slipped out of Indiana with $800,000 in settlement funds. The look of a man running the numbers on whether he could bolt. But this time, Clifton had no exit because the next slide was going to prove he'd run this same play before. I clicked forward. The screen filled with a document I'd kept locked in my personal files for 17 years. Louisville Fire Department Investigation Report 2006. Subject: Ardmore Commercial Properties, Warehouse Fire. Before I could continue, Hector Faulkner rose and fanned the fire safety inspection reports across the table, his engineer's seal showing on every page. "Good morning. I'm Hector Faulkner, licensed fire safety engineer, 30 years in the field," he said, unrolling the red-marked blueprints. I reviewed the Raleigh Heritage building plans and safety certifications at Mr. DeVroe's request. What I found goes well beyond inadequate. It's criminally negligent. He set the first document in front of Everett Colby. The fire system inspection is dated February 1st, 2022, but the construction permit shows second-floor framing wasn't complete until February 18th. You cannot inspect a system that has yet to be installed. Vivian Hartwell leaned in, running her finger along the dates. Randall Osberg was already typing notes on his phone. The second-floor sprinkler configuration. Hector went on, violates Indiana Fire Code requirements on spacing water pressure and activation timing. If fire breaks out upstairs, the system will not respond correctly. "How bad are we talking?" Everett asked. 200 capacity. Hector said, no inflection. Families at birthday dinners, anniversary celebrations, children's events. If this restaurant opens with this system and a fire starts upstairs, people die. 200 capacity. Families celebrating birthdays. The sprinklers wouldn't fire. Hector placed another document on the table. This signature belongs to Clement Dravecki, professional engineer. I worked alongside Clem for 15 years. He retired in January 2020. He tapped the digital signature at the bottom of the inspection report. Someone pulled his credentials from archived files, and the individual who submitted this fraudulent document to Meridian Shield. Hector indicated the submission record is Weston Burrell. He looked up. Mr. Burrell holds no engineering license, no fire safety certification, no professional credentials of any description. Then why does his name appear on the safety report? Conrad asked. I advanced the equity slide. Weston Burrell received 8% ownership in Raleigh Heritage Dining in exchange for filing fire safety documents under a retired engineer's stolen credentials. He's Garrett's close friend from college, no qualifications whatsoever. And in return for placing 200 lives at risk, he holds 8% of a company built entirely on fraud. Garrett's face had turned gray. He had been aware of Weston's signature through his cooperation meetings, but being told something is a paperwork problem is different from hearing a 30-year engineer call it a death trap in front of a room full of people. This project cannot open, Hector said. Not with these violations, not with these systems. It is waiting for a spark. I stood again and reached for the file I'd set beside my laptop. Which brings us to Clifton Ardmore's history. Clifton's expression shifted that same calculation I'd seen 17 years ago, the instant before a man decides to run. I opened the folder. Louisville, Indiana, 2006. Ardmore Commercial Properties Warehouse Fire. Insurance claim $2.3 million. I was the independent investigator assigned to evaluate that claim. I spread the documents across the table where the whole room could read them. Fire department reports, unusual burn patterns, inventory records showing substantial stock removal in the 2 weeks before the fire, evidence pointing to a staged incident. But before the investigation could reach its conclusion, I said Clifton Ardmore dissolved his company Ardmore Commercial Properties, renamed it Raleigh Investments, and left the state. The insurer settled for a fraction of the claim, rather than absorb the litigation costs. And Clifton disappeared. I looked directly at him across the table. Until his daughter married my son, until his name turned up in the Meridian Shield assessment file, until I recognized the identical pattern 17 years on, fabricated capital fraudulent paperwork, and a timetable built around collecting money and vanishing before anyone could move. 17 years I'd carried that Louisville file knowing he'd escaped. He had no escape today. Clifton shoved back his chair, the legs scraping hard against the floor. This is a smear campaign from a bitter old man who can't accept being left behind. Mr. Ardmore, sit down. Conrad's voice came across the room, flat and final. He was already typing. Meridian Shield will be submitting these findings in their entirety to the Indiana Department of Insurance within 60 days per state regulation. All coverage for this project is denied effective immediately. The room went quiet. No insurance means no loan, Everett Colby said, almost to himself. Old National Bank will not extend financing to a hospitality project carrying forged safety records, a fabricated capital structure, and a principal investor with a documented history of insurance fraud. Vivian Hartwell was gathering her papers. Randall Osberg shut his laptop with a hard click. Clifton was still standing, but the calculation had gone out of his face. He looked diminished, older, somehow, smaller. The man who'd spent 17 years constructing a new identity, a new reputation, a new scheme, all of it coming apart in a single conference room. You can't do this, he said. The authority was gone from his voice. There are contracts, agreements, investors. Had investors, Vivian Hartwell said, already moving past him. Past tense, I'm out. And I'll be advising my investment group to steer clear of anything connected to Clifton Ardmore Raleigh Investments, or whatever name comes next. Randall Osberg nodded. We're done. Clifton lowered himself back into his chair. The 2006 Louisville investigation report lay open on the table before him, his old company name circled in red on notes I'd written 17 years ago. Ardmore Commercial Properties, the name he'd buried banking on time and distance to keep it down. Conrad was already moving on his phone, filing the formal insurance denial, drafting the regulatory notice to the Indiana Department of Insurance, forwarding the fraud documentation to Meridian Shield's legal team. 200 lives protected by paperwork, Clifton had been certain no one would ever surface. I watched him sitting there, spent, nowhere left to go. June 20th was 12 days out. The Panama ticket was still in his reservation system, but federal authorities had been watching him for weeks. The offshore account Nadette had handed me contained evidence of wire fraud. The Louisville file established pattern. The trap had been sealed. But Renee wasn't finished. She had one card remaining, and she was about to play it by pushing everyone else into the wreckage ahead of her. She rose from her chair, both hands pressing the table edge, and when she spoke, her voice was controlled, precise, composed. The voice of someone who had rehearsed for exactly this moment. "I want to be transparent with everyone in this room," she said, drawing a folder from her briefcase. Garrett managed the financial documentation on his own. I had no awareness of his use of Lawton's funds, the forged safety certifications, or any of the fraudulent representations that have been described today. She placed printed emails on the table and slid them toward Everett Colby and Conrad Elway. These messages show that he directed everything: the capital structure, the safety filings, the insurance application. Her tone was measured, suffused with wounded dignity. "I placed my full trust in my husband. I had no idea he was stealing from his own father." Several investors reached for the emails. Vivian Hartwell's expression shifted certainty, giving way to doubt. Garrett sat motionless, staring at the documents his wife had just used to bury him. "I'm as much a victim in this as Lawton," Renee continued. "A wife kept entirely in the dark by—" "Before Ms. Devereaux goes any further," Celeste said, rising quietly, "there's something this room needs to see." She opened her laptop and connected it to the projector. A legal document expanded across the screen. VWH Hospitality Holdings Corporate Structure Agreement. Celeste said, her voice unhurried. Created November 8, 2021 at 2:00 a.m. She zoomed to the metadata footer. IP address 192.168.1.140. Renee Devereaux's home computer confirmed through ISP records. She let the room read it. This agreement transfers all intellectual property branding rights and operating licenses to VWH Hospitality Holdings upon project funding. Garrett Devereaux is listed as director. 0 ownership stake. 0 voting rights. 0 control. Garrett's face went white. He was staring at the projection like a man who had never laid eyes on that document, because he hadn't. That wasn't the whole contract. It wasn't the full measure of what she'd planned. Celeste scrolled forward, page 12, Article 7, Section 3, and read aloud a 12% commission payable to Clifton Ardmore for his role in securing seed capital and keeping the family bound to the project. Signed November 8th, a full 3 months before she stood across from me and said I had no right to a seat at the table. Renee's composure that carefully maintained armor broke open. "That document, it's just a preliminary draft." Celeste didn't waver. "The signature on it is yours. Dated time, stamped, submitted to the Indiana Secretary of State on November 10th, 2021, 48 hours after it was drawn up. 3 months before, you sat at the Magnolia Terrace dinner and told Lawton he was fit for nothing but scraps off other people's plates." Silence swallowed the room whole. Garrett hadn't moved his eyes from the screen. He was reading the contract his wife had executed while he lay beside her, the evidence that her plan had always included leaving him with nothing. "You were going to take everything," he said, barely above a whisper. "Not asking, understanding. My life's work, every dollar, every decision, gone the instant the money landed." Renee lowered herself back into her chair. The composure was gone. The wounded dignity was gone. What remained was a woman who'd played her last hand and found it already beaten. Everett Colby shut his laptop one clean final snap. Old National Bank is pulling the $6.4 million construction loan effective immediately. A project rooted in fraud, forged paperwork, and criminal coordination is not one we will finance. Conrad Elway's fingers hadn't stopped moving. Meridian Shield Insurance is denying all coverage. Formal fraud complaints go to the Indiana Department of Insurance, the Attorney General, and federal regulators within 48 hours. Vivian Hartwell and Randall Osberg push back their chairs at the same moment, collecting their things without a word. 2 more investors peeled away behind them. The room was draining. Men and women who'd walked in expecting a pitch were now walking out of what had become a crime scene. Renee surged to her feet again, her voice splitting apart. "You've stolen your own granddaughter's future. Lawton, your blood. Ren is going to spend her whole life knowing her grandfather came here to ruin her parents out of bitterness." I got up slowly, met her eyes without flinching. "Renee," I said, "that's not what happened. You and Garrett made that choice yourselves the day you decided my money had value and my presence had none." Each word seemed to strike her somewhere beneath the surface. The color drained from her face. Then I faced my son, the same man who'd sat silent in that other room while his wife stripped me of my dignity, who hadn't said one word to stop it. "I love you, Garrett." My voice didn't rise. "Nothing changes that, but there's no path I can walk for you. You chose this yourself." He gave a single nod, no words, perhaps none remained. I left the banquet room. Alden and Celeste fell into step behind me. Wren was in the hallway, standing there with her backpack, the same one she'd lugged to the courthouse all those weeks ago, watching the door. "Grandpa," she said softly, "should we take the chair to remember maybe?" I looked at this child, 12 years old. She'd sat alone with a cracked tablet and quietly documented everything her parents were doing because her moral compass worked better than theirs ever had. Something in me let go. I felt myself smile the first time in weeks that had happened naturally. "We don't need it, Wren. I've found where I belong." She already knew what that chair had stood for, better than anyone still inside those walls. Together we moved through the corridor past the hostess stand, where Lena had clocked in on that February evening, past the main dining room entrance where regular people were having regular dinners with no idea that the private room behind them had just watched a conspiracy come apart at the seams. Celeste pushed the door open. Morning light hit us, June sunlight steady and unhurried. Wren slipped her hand into mine. Her fingers were small and certain, safe. We stepped out through Magnolia Terrace's front entrance into the open air. Behind us in the room, where I had once been told to be grateful for table scraps, my son sat beside the woman who had tried to discard them both, and a man who'd been running from me across 17 years. All three of them now encircled by what they'd constructed together. Wren had no more questions. Sometimes the quiet is the whole answer. The fallout moved through the weeks that followed, touching everyone the scheme had reached precisely as I'd expected it to. 12 days out from Magnolia Terrace, Alden Northrop rang with the opening report. Federal agents had picked up Clifton Ardmore at Indianapolis International Airport. That morning, he said caught at the gate trying to board Panama Airlines, Flight 204, June 20th, 5:47 a.m. June 20th. The date Nadette's notebook had marked as his exit. The date my tip to federal authorities filed back in April had flagged as his moment to disappear. "They had him before he boarded?" I asked. "Right there at the gate. That one-way ticket is Exhibit A, now in a fraud investigation crossing multiple states." There was a quiet satisfaction in Alden's voice. "The Louisville Warehouse Fire, 2006. The Raleigh Magnolia Terrace scheme. 2 separate cases out of Indiana and Pennsylvania that agents found once they started pulling threads. Clifton is facing federal exposure going back 17 years. I was at my kitchen table, coffee cooling beside me, untouched. June light coming through the same window I'd stared at 4 months ago, the morning the guardianship petition arrived. "The others," I said. "What happened?" "Renee's Indiana event planning license was revoked yesterday. Licensing board pointed to the fraud inquiry and professional misconduct. She's selling off assets to cover what investors are demanding. Vivian Hartwell, Randall Osberg, and 3 others have put in combined claims of $340,000. $340, a fraction of what Renee had envisioned pulling from the shell company. Nothing close to the property equity she'd maneuvered to capture. Just enough, though, to leave her with nothing. "Weston Burrell?" I asked. "Every certification gone. Criminal charges for document fraud. He used the license of a dead engineer to sign off on a life safety system. Prosecutors are pushing for 5 years. 5 years. For an 8% stake in a building that never opened. For gambling 200 lives against a forged name on a piece of paper. And Garrett." A beat of silence. "He's giving prosecutors everything: emails, wire transfers, meeting records. How much he hands over shapes what comes next for him, Lawton. That's his road. Not one you can travel on his behalf." June 20th, 5:47 a.m. Clifton had expected to be invisible by now. He'd miscalculated. I thanked Alden and set down the phone. Courts move the way courts move. Evidence gets cataloged, charges get filed, dates get set. I'd done my part, gathered the records. Given testimony, sat across from investigators and answered every question. What happened next wasn't mine to steer. 9 days after that, Alden asked to come by rather than call. He laid documents across my kitchen table, spread them out over the same surface where the pocket watch had been sitting all along. Renee filed for divorce on June 29th. He told me, handing me the paperwork, She wants an equal split of the marital assets and full custody of Ren. Her position is that she was deceived an innocent spouse who had no part in Garrett's scheme. I read through the custody filing. Dense legal text asserting that Ren Devro should live exclusively with Mother Renee Devro, that Father Garrett Devro receive only supervised contact, and that grandfather visitation rights went entirely unmentioned. The family court took it up yesterday, Alden went on. They had the full record from the guardianship proceeding, including Ren's recordings. Those recordings, half a year's worth of a 12-year-old girl holding a device steady in hidden moments, capturing what the adults in her life were doing because she knew without being told that it was wrong. Sole custody was denied, Alden said. The bench cited Renee's recorded conversations, the ones where she laid out the plan to have you institutionalized, liquidate your property, and position Ren as leverage in the fraud. The ruling was that a parent who turns their child into an instrument of elder exploitation hasn't earned the right to raise that child alone. He drew out a second document. Ren's primary residence is with Garrett, but your visitation is written in as a guaranteed right. It doesn't hinge on whatever becomes of Garrett's criminal case. If he goes to prison, Ren still sees you every week. Something that had been braced inside my chest since February finally gave way. She can come see me, I said quietly. Regularly, that's the part that matters. Everything else, the custody arrangements, Garrett's sentencing, Renee's financial collapse, Alden began. I'll leave to time I finished. A 12-year-old had done what no lawyer could have engineered, and she'd sealed the bond between us in the process. Alden stacked his papers and moved toward the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame. One more thing, Lawton. The appraisal holds your house sits at $2.8 million. With the guardianship thrown out and Clifton's fraud unwound, you have complete authority over your own assets. You could sell, downsize, spend your remaining years very well provided for. My eyes went to the pocket watch. 4 generations of Devro men. A great-grandfather who built something from a single small house. A grandfather who gave 30 years to the same factory floor day after day. A father who drilled into me early and often that a man's word outlasted his bank account. That comfort isn't what I'm after, I said. Alden waited. It's 71 years old, Alden. I've got no use for $2.8 million sitting in an account, but I know exactly what it can become. At the support center, he said low and careful, the one Celeste described, for elderly people whose finances were taken from them. Legal help counseling records support a real place for them to land. With a chair for every single person who walks through the door. He nodded slowly. I'll draw up the paperwork. Irrevocable trust, I said. 2 halves. Half goes toward Ren's education. She touches it at 25. The other half builds the center. Celeste holds the trustee role for both. You're certain? I looked at the watch one more time. Time keeps faith. Those were the words cut into the case. Not time keeps wealth. Not time keeps land. Time keeps faith. Those were my words as Alden walked out. I stayed behind at the kitchen table, the legal summary spread across it. Clifton staring down federal charges. Renee broke and divorced. Weston waiting on his own trial date. Garrett had cut a deal cooperation for a lighter sentence. And Ren locked in for weekly visits with her grandfather. The pocket watch was where it had been since April, resting on that same table patient as ever. Holding on to the property for myself was never what this was about. What I had in mind was bigger. Alden Northrup's office had a particular smell-aged law books underneath something freshly polished. The scent of order I'd spent 6 months piecing back together. We were in mid-July, 5 weeks past Magnolia Terrace, and the paperwork was finally done. Celeste occupied the client chair to my left, her eyes moving through the trust agreement one last time. Alden was on his feet behind the desk. The irrevocable trust document squared into neat piles, every page marked with a colored tab. The house stays mine as long as I'm breathing, I said, walking through what we'd structured. The rest gets divided. Half goes to Ren's schooling, she can access it at 25. The other half funds the center. Irrevocable, that means nobody touches it afterward. Correct, not yourself, included Mr. Devro. Alden pressed a finger to the title page. Your signature makes it final. No amendments, no reversals, no carve-outs, not from family, not from circumstance. You're sure about this? My eyes went to Celeste. 20 years she'd worked at my side, tracing fraud through layers of corporate cover, chasing money into shell company after shell company. Now she was the person overseeing what I meant to leave behind. Certain, I said. 71 years of being sure about all the wrong things. This is the one I've got right. Alden set a pen in my hand, same heft as the ones I'd handled signing off on case reports for 38 years. Solid, balanced, ink that wouldn't fade. I put my name down, Lawton Devereux grantor, formalizing an irrevocable trust to secure my granddaughter's future and establish a center for elderly exploitation victims. The last document I'd signed with that kind of permanence was the house deed back in 1987, when I still believed that holding things constant was the same as keeping them safe. I knew better now. What matters is that the right things outlive you. Celeste signed as trustee. Alden witnessed. The notary moved through each page with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "It's finished," Alden said, his voice low. "The Indianapolis Financial Exploitation Support Center has its funding, and Wren's Education Trust is locked in." I leaned back. Something that had been coiled up tight since February finally let go. The house that Renee had plotted to pry away from me, that Garrett had earmarked to liquidate for his schemes, that Clifton had folded into his exit strategy, every square foot of it, now committed to things none of them could get near. "Thank you," I told him. Alden held out his hand. "A lot of people will be helped by what this center does, Lawton. People who won't have to wage that fight by themselves the way you did." A couple of weeks after that, I had Wren over, just her and me. Nothing elaborate lasagna garlic bread, the food a 12-year-old will actually eat without complaint. She showed up at 6 with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her hair was in that ponytail she'd taken to since the last day of school. "Grandpa," she said at the door, wrapping her arms around me. "Something smells really good. Your grandmother's recipe," I told her. "Every Sunday without fail, when your father was about your age." We ate where I had read the guardianship petition, where Garrett had phoned his lawyer to make his deal, where the pocket watch had been sitting all those months. After the plates were cleared, I went and got the watch from next to my laptop. "Wren," I said, pulling up a chair across from her. "The tradition was always eldest son. 4 generations of Devereux men wore this." She studied the silver case, the engraved face picking up the kitchen light. "But I'm not following that tradition," I told her. "I'm giving it to whoever keeps their word, who was the one who got the truth on record when nobody else would have, who figured out that sometimes loving someone means exposing what they're doing." I set the watch down in her palms. "Grandpa," her voice snagged. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say a word. Hold on to it. Remember what it stands for." Wren cradled it in both hands, turning it slowly, the way you handle something that might break. 12 years old, and she'd grasped something her own father still hadn't, that a family's legacy isn't measured in what gets passed down. It's measured in whether you were honest. I'd needed 6 months and a near catastrophe to learn that, but I'd learned it. Time keeps faith. She was reading the engraving. What's it mean? The truth surfaces eventually, no matter what. It means a man's word has more value than his reputation. It means a knock came at the front door, and the sentence went unfinished. I looked over at Wren. She lifted her shoulders. Nobody she'd told to come. I answered the door. Garrett was standing on the porch, a grocery bag in each hand. "Dad." That was all he said. No angle behind it, no pressure. I was thinking we could sit down together. No attorneys, no Renee, just father and son. He'd changed, hollowed out. The particular exhaustion of a man who'd been sitting across a table from federal investigators. I glanced back at Wren. She hadn't moved, the watch still resting in her grip. "Come in," I said. He put the bags on the counter and started unloading. Pasta sauce, bread, exactly what we'd just eaten. He caught sight of the dishes. "I should have called ahead," he said. "Stay anyway," Wren said, her voice even. "Grandpa always cooks more than enough." And so, there we were. 3 generations gathered at my kitchen table, Garrett near the window, Wren facing him from across the table with the watch safe in her pocket, and me at the head of the table where I'd always sat. Everybody had a place. What talking there was came out measured and slow. Garrett wanted to know how Wren's summer was going. Wren talked about what she'd been reading. I put coffee on. Nobody spoke. Long, uncomfortable gaps filled the air, the kind of silence that settles over people who are trying to piece back something they'd shattered. "I'm sorry," Garrett said at last. He was talking to Wren, not me. "I'm sorry you had to be the one recording everything. I'm sorry you had to act like the grown-up because we weren't." Wren gave a small nod. She didn't offer forgiveness, that wouldn't have been honest, but she stayed in her chair. The July light outside the window went amber and then gray. 3 generations, all of us seated. The watch that by rights should have been Garrett's was in Wren's pocket. The house that should have bankrolled a fraud now stood behind a cause worth backing. Forgiveness hadn't arrived yet. Maybe it had a longer road than that. But a start is a start, and after 6 months of things coming apart, I knew one when I was looking at it. Whatever had been set in motion that evening moved forward slowly through August. Healing doesn't keep a schedule. Some of it comes quickly. The rest shows up when it's ready. The support center carried the smell of new paint and cut lumber, not the smell of something closing down, but of something being opened. I was standing in the future common room, watching Stu Langford's crew work through the final punch list. Stu was a man in his 50s who didn't say much the contractor Celeste had brought in to run the build. He had a feel for what a space like this needed to be. A long table in the middle of the room, I'd said when we first talked through the plans. Seating for everyone. That table was in now, solid oak 12 chairs, set around it 2 more pushed against the wall. Spares, always available. Celeste was next to me, going over the construction checklist on her tablet. The quote on the back wall was, "My doing," she said, nodding toward the far end of the room, where the paint hadn't fully dried. "I hope that's all right. It sounded like something that would come from you." I took in the words painted in plain black letters on the white wall. No one should stand outside the family just because they have nothing left to take. "What's the chair count?" I asked. 12, Celeste said, and 2 more along the wall always. Nobody stands. I crossed to the table and laid my hand flat on the oak. 6 weeks from now, this room would host its first group. Elderly men and women ground down by financial exploitation. People who'd found out their own kids, husbands, wives, caretakers had been draining them dry while saying it was out of love. People who just needed to be believed. "You've made something worthwhile here," Celeste said quietly. "We made it," I said. "I just brought the money Vera and I had put away across 35 years. You're the one who'll keep it running." She nodded, writing something on her tablet. September was the target opening. Legal consultations at no charge, financial guidance, help with documentation support groups, every resource I'd been without when I needed them most. Built so the next person wouldn't have to go without. 2 weeks on from that, Ren came to dinner. An ordinary Thursday. Every week since July, she'd been showing up. Sometimes Garrett came too, more often just her. This Thursday was just her. Lasagna garlic bread, the kind of meal that gets better for the company around it. After we ate, Ren reached into her backpack and set the pocket watch on the table between us. "I want it to live here, Grandpa," she said, "so it's here each time I come." I looked down at the silver case. 4 generations accounted for now. In the hands of a 12-year-old who already understood something most grown people hadn't worked out. "Your grandmother would have loved who you are," I told her. "Brave and stubborn and true." "Did she wear the vest too?" Ren asked. She was looking at the navy vest on the hook by the back door. Vera's choice. The one I'd had on at Magnolia Terrace back in February. I smiled at that. "No," I told her, "but she's the one who found it. Said it made me look like somebody worth trusting." "She was right," Ren said. We did the dishes side by side. Ren talked about the book she had going. I filled her in on the support center opening next month. Ordinary talk, easy talk. The kind of conversation you fall into once the emergency has lifted and you're figuring out how to simply exist around each other again. It took me 71 years to understand that family isn't defined by who takes from you. It's defined by who stays at the table when there's nothing left to take. Ren headed out at 8. I stood at the window and watched her cross the driveway to Garrett's car. Garrett raised a hand from behind the wheel, brief measured. We hadn't gotten to whatever comes after this. Maybe we wouldn't. But every Sunday without fail, my phone went off at 9 in the morning. "What did Ren have for dinner last night?" Garrett would ask. Not "how are you holding up?" Not another apology. Just that one question. "Lasagna," I'd tell him. Or chicken and rice. Or pizza, because neither of us had the energy to do anything else. "Good," he'd say. I want to make sure she's eating right." Then we'd hang up. Half a minute, maybe less. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation. Just a father checking on his daughter and a grandfather giving him the answer. Garrett was still working with the federal prosecutors, putting in hours at a smaller firm downtown, renting a place, waiting on his sentencing. The cooperation was worth something. Alden figured maybe 2 years rather than 5. Possibly probation if the judge found his remorse credible. I had no idea whether it was credible. I wasn't sure it changed anything. There are times when shielding the innocent generation means releasing your grip on the illusions you still hold about the one that made its choices. The watch ticked on the table, steady, patient, like a pulse waiting for whoever came next to lift it and carry it on. Clifton sat in federal custody, his trial still ahead. Renee had filed for bankruptcy and gone to stay with her sister out in Louisville. Weston had entered a guilty plea on document fraud. The investors had cut their losses and moved on. Magnolia Terrace restaurant was still open, new owners, now a proper fire suppression system, no trace of the Raleigh Magnolia name attached to it. And here I was, 71 years old, on a Thursday morning, standing in my own kitchen in a vest my wife had picked out with my great-grandfather's watch on the table in front of me, waiting for my granddaughter's next visit. The vest hung from its hook by the door, ready whenever I reached for it. The watch sat where it always sat, marking time, counting down to Wren's weekend visit. I stood at the window and let the August light come in. I'd put the vest on that morning. Nobody asked me to. Nobody expected it. I just wanted to. That was the distinction. That was the whole of it. That is where Lawton's story ends, not with noise, but with something quiet and solid. A pocket watch ticking on a kitchen table. A granddaughter who understood integrity before she was a teenager. And a man who finally knew what his name was worth. It cost him nearly everything to get there. His trust, his peace, months of sleep, and the version of his family he'd spent a lifetime believing in. What it gave him in return was clarity. I believe God puts certain things in motion slowly, not because the timing is cruel, but because some lessons only land when you've earned them the hard way. Lawton earned his. If this family revenge story stays with you, here is what I hope you carry from it. Document everything. Not because you distrust people, but because documentation is the only language some people are forced to respect. If someone is rushing you toward a decision about your own money or property, slow down. That urgency is almost never yours to feel. For adults, in 50 plus. Especially your assets. Your history and your judgment have real value. Don't let anyone reframe your wisdom as a liability. And if a child in your life shows you they understand honesty, recognize it. That is the inheritance worth passing on. If this story moved you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a thought in the comments. I genuinely want to know what stayed with you. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Honor Revenge Stories so you don't miss what comes next. Thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of yourself and take care of the ones who deserve it.